Thank you for coming in. I'm going to wait about 15, 30 more seconds. Got tons of people coming in, so that's good. Wonderful. Okay, well, it is 1:01, so I will start. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and editorial director of our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. And I am proud to be introducing our panel today, The Future of Counterterrorism, Start by Defining the Threat. I can think of no better time than now to be having this discussion. We are just 3 months out from the U.S. and NATO military withdrawal from Afghanistan, leaving questions about the future of the U.S. security role in the region. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has been rather close to the vest about its counterterrorism strategy in Central Asia and the greater Middle East. With that comes questions about the American drone program and its efficacy when it comes not only to U.S. security interests, but whether or not targeted killing and broader counterterrorism capabilities have duly taken into account human rights and the safeguarding of civilians on the ground in the countries in which the U.S. operates. We saw that in the U.S. drone strike in Kabul in August, and in recent revelations about a secret U.S. kill team operating in Syria from 2014 to 2019. Today's discussion will take all of these questions on with a focus on defining the threat and scope of the U.S. counterterrorism strategy today and how that applies to current conflict zones, including Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, Mali, Syria, and more. So let's get right to it. I will introduce our excellent panel and then hand things over to my colleague, Stephen Simon. First, we have Jutta Clausen. Jutta is a Lawrence Wine Professor of International Cooperation at Brandeis University and an affiliate for the Center of European Studies at Harvard University. She is the author of The Cartoons That Shook the World, about the worldwide protests against the Danish cartoons of the Muslim Prophet and the Islamic Challenge, Politics and Religion in Western Europe. In 2006, Clausen founded the Western Jihadism Project, which studies Western violent extremists associated with Al-Qaeda. Clausen is a regular commentator on BBC, Voice of America, and other US and international media. In 2021, Oxford University Press published her next book called Western Jihadism, A 30-Year History. Paul Pillar is a non-resident fellow of the Quincy Institute and non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. He is also an associate fellow of at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. He retired in 2005 from a 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community. He's the author of Negotiating Peace, War Termination as a Bargaining Process, Terrorism and U.S. Foreign Policy, Intelligence and U.S. Foreign Policy, Iraq, 9/11 and Misguided Reform, and Why America Misunderstands the World, National Experience and Roots of Misperception. Jacqueline Hazelton is an associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College, specializing in international relations. Her research interests include international security, compellence, great power military intervention, and U.S. foreign military policy. Her book, Bullets Not Ballots, Success in Counterinsurgency Warfare, was published by Cornell University Press. At the Belfer Center, Hazelton is writing her second book, which is on the reasons why Western great powers sometimes set ambitious, liberalizing goals for military interventions. And last but not least, my colleague, Stephen Simon, who will be moderating today, is a senior research analyst at the Quincy Institute and Robert E. Wilhelm Fellow at MIT's Center for International Studies. Prior to this, he was executive director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the U.S. and Middle East. From 2011 to 2012, he served on the National Security Council staff as senior director for Middle Eastern and North African affairs. He also worked on the NSC, on counterterrorism and Middle East security policy. He is co-author, among other books, of The Age of Sacred Terror, winner of the Arthur C. Ross Award for Best Book in International Relations. And he's now working on a new book the long goodbye, the United States and the Middle East from the Islamic Revolution to the Arab Spring. So with that, we have this amazing panel teed up to talk about these very important issues. So I am going to hand this over to my colleague, Stephen, and I'll be back to close out the event.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I appreciate that introduction. Let's get right to it. But actually, before we get right to it, you will see, I'm addressing the audience now, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. If you have a question that you wish to post, please just press that button and type in your question. I'm going to start off myself with a general question for our panelists, and I guess the order in which I'd like you all to address them is Jutta, Jill, and Paul. The questions are really big picture questions. The first is, where do we stand with respect to the terrorist threat to the United States? How bad is it? What's the nature of the threat? How does it differ from the threat we faced 20 years ago when Al-Qaeda launched their devastating attacks on 9/11? And secondly, what change in U.S. counterterrorism policies do you think would be warranted at this juncture? As Kelly was saying, it's been an incredibly, eventful 20 years, 2 major interventions, the use of innovations like torture, heightened pervasive surveillance, targeted killing, the great expansion of special ops forces, unlimited congressional authorization of these operations, and of course, the advent of Homeland Security as an enormous independent agency with a very large remit. So these are all major developments of the past 20 years. So what in your view needs to be adjusted? What in your view is good for the foreseeable future? So those are the broad questions. And again, let me start with Jutta on this.
So my grave concern is that we have time and time again underestimated the capabilities and the reach and the tenacity of jihadist extremism. It is a globalizing organization, and I use the word organization deliberately because I think maybe there are people who know, but I think in the public debates, the degree of integration and organization of this movement has been severely underestimated. It is, I think, very important to always remember the big picture. And the big picture is that every time we think that it's gone, the movement has come back ever stronger and more diffused. And looking back, the Syrian civil war was an extraordinary injection of cash, gold, manpower, experience, and globalized recruitment that today have put us in a situation where, by many estimates, Al-Qaeda, and I'm here talking just about Al-Qaeda, not about ISIS, is 10 times the strength that it was at the time of 9/11. Now, you ask also about what is the direct threat to the United States. And there, I am concerned that threat is often equated with capability to attack the homeland in the manner of the 9/11 attacks. That is not on the picture today, but I think it's important to recall that Al-Qaeda hasn't, and Ayman al-Zawahiri apparently is still alive, and even if he wasn't, I'm not sure he was dead. I'm not sure it would matter much. The ultimate goal remains the same, even if the tactics have recently changed, and I'll speak about that shortly. There has been no attacks on the United States territory in recent years, and the effort has really been focusing on establishing what bin Laden used to refer to as Emirates. So we have a rolling insurgency and fighter groups that take up territory and sit down temporarily from North Africa to West Africa to East Africa, across the Middle East to into Asia. And now the High Command has once again gotten a safe haven. Even as the United States sat down to negotiate with the Taliban in Doha, Ayman al-Zawahiri was meeting with the deputy leader of the Haqqani network in February 2020. We have that information from the UN Security Council's analysis team and monitoring team. So the whole story about the question is, will Al-Qaeda now be back in Afghanistan, is irrelevant. Al-Qaeda is back in Afghanistan. So we should think about, what does that mean? What is the threat that comes from that? And in my view, the real issue is today that the global security picture has changed dramatically. So we are looking at a large number of mid-range conflicts, smaller conflicts, where the fighter groups really, that associated sort of network way with a cadre of experienced fighters traveling from one location to another, where the goal is to roll back Western influences and destabilizing the local governments. And the threat then to the United States is actually to the globalization program. It is to the effort to roll out liberal economies and promote democracy and stability across Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And that, I think, is where we should think about the real threat.
Okay, thank you very much. But actually, before I let you go, so do you see a major change entailed by these conclusions for U.S. policy?
Yeah, so I would never actually thought that the whole war metaphor was an appropriate one, war on terror and all of that. I think there were particular reasons that that language was embraced, and that was because it aided in the creation of claims to executive power. It had to be war, and it was war in Afghanistan. I belong to the group of people who think that this was a war that initially was a good idea and then became a bad idea and then became an even worse idea. We need to think about this fight as one of containment and a perpetual, if you want to use the war metaphor, I call it perpetual war.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jill.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very glad to be joining you. And I need to emphasize that the views I'm expressing are my own, not those of any government entity. In a twist on the World War II British argument about air power, I suggest that a bomber will always get through. Some number of attacks on US interests at home and abroad is inevitable simply because of US wealth and power and because of its continued interest post-Cold War in global spread. The question is, what is bearable compared to what the United States can accomplish with the forward defense or an active offense? And who is likely to be responsible for these attacks? I'll briefly address those in order: threat, targets, and suggestions for addressing the problem, all of which are already entrained but are worth underlining. The focus here today is on jihadi violence, or more broadly, terrorism by Islamist groups. The most important point that I can make is that the majority of Muslim and Islamic terrorists and insurgent groups are focused on their own government and their own people. Fawaz Gerges famously identified this as a focus on the near enemy. What was new to many in the West after the attacks of 9/11 was al-Qaeda's central focus on the far enemy, primarily the United States, for its role in propping up, protecting, and arming those near enemies like the Egyptian and Saudi governments. Osama bin Laden wanted to drive the United States out of the Middle East so he and his group could topple those firmly entrenched regional dictators and take over to create a more just and a more godly system. Today, as you heard from Professor Clausen, there is serious disagreement over whether Al-Qaeda Central has been degraded or not. I lean to the position that its capabilities have been badly reduced over the past 20 years. Its communications and planning abilities have been reduced, its organization disrupted, and it has lost a long string of seconds in command. This inevitably lessens the threat that it poses to the far enemy. The more immediate threat of jihad or Islamist groups fighting their own is jihadi or Islamist groups who are fighting their own governments in their own lands and in adjacent areas. But that is danger to those governments and peoples rather than to the United States. In addition, when it comes to groups that want to target the United States, we have to consider their capabilities as well as their will. For the most part, their capabilities are quite limited. We have to remember just what a fluke 9/11 was. In the United States and Western Europe, rather than more attacks akin to 9/11, thankfully, we see so-called lone wolf or mad dog attacks by individuals. This is tragic, but it is not an existential threat to any state. These are likely to continue in their scattered fashion. Whether we consider the fundamental cause of these attacks to be ideological or psychological or both, it is very difficult to stop an individual or a small group determined to kill a lot of people quickly. We see this with school shooters, movie theater shooters, casino shooters, and others such as the anti-government terrorists who bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, and the anti-abortion, anti-government terrorists who bombed the Olympics in Atlanta in 1996. So, what to do? The most important step the United States can take to protect the homeland is to build resilience. There were calls for this immediately after 9/11, and very little was done. In fact, the situation has gotten worse. Building resilience includes hardening nuclear sites, natural gas plants, railroads that carry huge tankers filled with corrosive chemicals. These are, I don't even want to say how easy these sites are to be attacked, but that is where my nightmares lie. Along with these steps.
Nobody can know.
What?
I just said, shh, nobody can know.
Oh, I told you now I'll have to kill you. All right, so along with.
Okay, so resilience should be the focus.
Resilience and also rebuilding the first responders across the country.
Okay, which is more broadly part of resilience. So okay, I'm going to ask you and Paul to respond more directly to Yutta's argument, which is that, well, there is a threat to the United States because the United States is, I'm paraphrasing Yutta right now, but the United States is a status quo power. We want stability in the region. It's a U.S. interest. And the turmoil introduced by these terrorist groups and their attacks on their own governments run counter to this, U.S. strategic objective of maintaining stability in the regions. Ergo, these groups pose a threat to the United States. So maybe let's go to Paul, and then we'll come back to that. Paul?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Steve. Let me make 5 points that I think respond to your initial question and also your follow-on. And the first is that any terrorist threat against the United States that will come from abroad in the coming years is less going to be a matter of a fixed set of bad guys determined to do ill to the United States no matter what. And more will depend to a large degree, and again, we're talking about terrorist threats against the United States, depend to a large degree on what the United States itself does that might motivate or not motivate people to resort to the extreme tactic of terrorism. Now, that's not the way these threats are normally discussed, probably because to many ears it sounds too much like blaming the United States for becoming a victim, but that's not what I'm saying. And there always will be some terrorists who, a la Osama bin Laden, would go after the United States as the far enemy as a way to indirectly get at the near enemy. But most of the threat today and in the years ahead will be more a matter of the kind of hatred that has surfaced and that has exhibited themes that have been very familiar from interrogations of captured terrorists, claim statements, and propaganda. Themes such as the presence and activities of the U.S. military abroad, the U.S. association with the plight of the Palestinians, and so forth. If we're mindful of this relationship between what the U.S. does and the shape of the future terrorist threat, then we also ought to be mindful of how terrorism and counterterrorism can be related, and how what we do in the name of counterterrorism can actually be counterproductive. And I think we had a couple of reminders of that back in August during the last days of the pulling out of Afghanistan. One was that bombing that killed 13 U.S. Marines by ISIS. It was largely intended to demonstrate that the Taliban didn't have control, but it was also aimed at a U.S. target that was seen as an occupying force. And also about the same time was that drone strike that killed a bunch of innocent Afghan civilians, the sort of thing that's happened too often in the so-called war on terror, and has elicited the kind of hatreds I'm talking about. Second point, I think the most frequent anti-U.S. attacks in the years ahead will be the work largely of individuals and small groups and small cells, rather than large organizations that are capable of a 9/11 type spectacular. Of course, we have to be mindful of the spectacular, but I make this assertion for a couple of reasons. One, just as an intelligence problem, it's harder to put on one screen a cell or individual whose very first operation is an anti-U.S. terrorist attack, as opposed to a known group that's already something we've been working much against. Also, it's a matter of defensive measures, and this gets into some of the resilience issues that Professor Hazelton mentioned. Much has been done to protect against the big attacks, especially civil aviation, and that leaves all the low-tech stuff that is basically impossible to defend against, including shooting sprees and something I expect to see more of, using vehicles to mow down pedestrians in crowds and along streets. Point number 3, these threats are not geographically bound in the sense of being associated with specific countries. We've had a tendency, of course, to think about Afghanistan in those terms because of the traumatic history of 9/11. But a physical patch of real estate is actually one of the less important determinants of terrorist threats against the United States. And I think the 9/11 operation itself illustrates that, preparation and management of which took place mostly not inside Afghanistan, but in places like apartments in Europe, flight schools in the United States, and cyberspace. And besides, to the extent that any patch of real estate does matter, there are plenty of other places, of course, rather than Afghanistan, that are either unstable or have presumably at least partially sympathetic regimes or authorities in whatever area we're talking about. In all these places, non-counterterrorist considerations need to weigh on U.S. policy just as much as counterterrorism ones do. And insofar as insurgency or terrorism or any other forms of internal instability are a problem, that doesn't necessarily immediately apply a U.S. role. You can think of, for example, the role of the French in the Sahel, which leads me to my fourth point, which is, although we're focusing specifically on threats against the United States, foreign liaison always will be, as it has been in the past, extremely important in counterterrorism, because local authorities are simply better positioned than the U.S. to do most of the necessary things in terms of intelligence collection at the tactical level, raids, arrests, and so on. At the same time, we need to be careful. I'll give me about 30 more seconds, Steve.
No, I'm not cutting you off. I'm not cutting you off. I'm not cutting off.
Right.
Just like
this is a pause, not a timeout.
No. Yeah, just explain to the audience what liaison is, because it's a kind of a technical term that people might not be aware of.
Sorry. Okay, just simply cooperation either between intelligence or security or police services on a particular problem like counterterrorism. And the point I'm trying to make right here is that this is something that doesn't necessarily require political kumbaya on other issues. In my own experience, and I know in yours, counterterrorism has been one of the last things to fall by the wayside when we've had serious political differences against governments. And when I was in the service working on counterterrorism, some of my meetings with foreign counterparts were counterparts in governments we would consider much more as adversaries rather than as allies. I think that's a lesson we need to apply right today to Afghanistan and the problem of ISIS in Afghanistan, bearing in mind that the Taliban is the biggest weapon the world has against ISIS in Afghanistan at the moment. They are mortal enemies. My fifth and last point, Steve, which bears on your original question, is we simply need to put into perspective the true extent and nature of terrorist threats, compared to other public policy problems. We've had through the years all the old comparisons we could make with bathtub drownings and lightning strikes and so on. And now we can compare also with things like climate-related natural disasters or deaths from COVID, in comparison to which, the casualties from terrorism barely make rounding errors. And although our main subject today is foreign jihadis, and I don't want to stray from that too much, we do need to recognize that based on recent patterns, the kind of perpetrator who will be most likely behind terrorist attacks that will claim American victims, especially right here in the United States, is much different, namely domestic extremists, especially of the right wing and white supremacist variety. I think if there's a date we need to think of as a special date when we think of terrorist threats against Americans in the years ahead, it's probably less September 11th than January 6th. This is related to our concern about foreign jihadists because that concern has, unfortunately, fed a xenophobia that has also been turned inward. And it has turned inward amidst a recent U.S. political history that has included such things as the election of the first Black U.S. president, succeeded by a president who has fed these xenophobic themes into what passes for mainstream American politics. Now, tackling that problem raises a whole set of other issues and challenges, but that's a subject for another forum and another day. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks. We've got about a half an hour left, and I'd like to reserve most of that for audience Q&A. But I was wondering if I could get just a minute from each of you on the role that Homeland Security played in preventing intruder attacks on the United States in the past 20 years, because we know that there have been, just the attack in Pensacola, relatively recently was a foreign intruder attack that was successful, but I'm hard pressed to think of others since 9/11. And I just wanted to gauge just snap judgments from the three of you on, well, was this because Homeland Security was pretty good, or was this because there was really nobody out there? There was no
way to tell
out there.
That's
Pardon?
an impossible question to answer. We have no data, no way to collect data on that.
I'm very disappointed, Jill.
We do have some data. I've been collecting some data. There have been credible threats. The most important one to remember is a campaign that was organized by Rashid Rauf in direct coordination with bin Laden, who was at that point in time still sitting alive in Abbottabad, that involved an attack on the New York subway. But that was actually exactly as Paul says, that was the result of international cooperation and intelligence sharing, because it was part of a campaign that also would involve the UK and a couple of other targets. So no, we have had Americans who have been engaged in planning and preparation for some pretty severe attacks that were averted. I'm thinking here particularly about a man named Headley, Duat Galani, who was commissioned. He was an agent working both for the for different terrorist groups, but it was commissioned to do the advanced spying to attack targets in Denmark, and was involved also in the Mumbai attack. So I think I'm disagreeing with my fellow panelists on their assessment of the degree of capabilities and professionalism involved in mounting some of these attacks. And they also, in order to get a real assessment, it's very important also to look at the missed attacks, the averted ones, the ones that failed, of which have been many more than people regularly acknowledge.
Okay, interesting difference of views on there. I was just curious about that because it bears on, where the United States invests, over time, looking down the road in the counterterrorism arena. Okay, we've got a few questions from the audience. Let's start with John Whitbeck, who asks, since so-called terrorists have proliferated exponentially since the U.S. launched its war on terror, and as Yutta's data would suggest, shouldn't, that's my editorialization, shouldn't American decision makers at least consider whether their so-called counterterrorism program has caused this proliferation? That's actually a point that Paul had addressed. That was his first and most prominent point in his response. But do any of the panelists want to make a brief comment on this question beyond what's been said?
I would like to. First, reverting back to the question of what we can know and not know about attacks and planned attacks. We have here Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns. We know that plots have been discovered. We do not know the number of plots that have not been, and that means we cannot gauge to what degree U.S. and partner counterterrorism efforts are successful. We simply can't know. To the immediate point, I think Paul's point about the strategic interaction between terrorist groups, insurgencies, and states is a critical one. We see the rise in the spread of jihadi ideology. We see the rise in the spread of political violence associated with this ideology in pretty much every area where U.S. forces have been flowing in for the past 20 years. We saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq, we see it in Nigeria, we see it in Niger, we see it in Mali, where the French are predominant, but the U.S. are also present, Somalia. We have to consider the possibility that the questioner is raising and that Paul raised, that there are ways in which the U.S. effort specifically is increasing the problem, although I still characterize the threat as quite limited compared to others.
We could add that
sorry, Paul, proceed.
The single most radicalizing event in the biography of Osama bin Laden was the U.S. military deployment to Saudi Arabia as part of Operation Desert Shield back in 1990-91.
Yeah, he was completely deranged by that, actually. So these are direct challenges to your argument about permanent war and the need really to be out there constantly checking the advances of these groups that develop in the Middle East, Africa, South Asia, and even Asia. So what's your response to this?
U.S. counterterrorism efforts do not cause jihadism to grow. No, not true. It's a false correlation, and there isn't even a correlation. The jihadist movement that we're dealing with is, as Gilles Kepel said, engaged in a war over control of the Muslim mind. This is a war within Islam, and what they seek to do is to push out all Western influences and interests, and that is through a strategy of attrition and building bases. And then the point is that it's an apocalyptic movement. What comes next, according to the ideology, and which is translates directly into strategy and tactics, is that there will be this final battle where there will be a mano a mano fight of control over what Muslims should think and believe. So this is, globalization has been a terrific aid in the spread of the movement, and it grows on modern technology. It grows on the ease of travel. It grows on open borders. It grows on the collapse of states that no longer has control. or the territory, but it's also much like global migration. It's an example of, one of the things we always say when we study migration is that it's not poverty that causes migration, it's the injection of a little bit of cash that causes global migration. And that's what we are dealing with. It is the dislocations associated with globalization, more broadly speaking. But the West has been a central element in facilitating the growth of this movement. And Western technologies have been very important in the development. And I mean, just look at bin Laden's first satellite phone that he used to call London, where he had his headquarters and a bank account at Barclays Bank while he was sitting in Afghanistan. So I disagree respectfully with my fellow panelists.
That's a very interesting disagreement because it's so fundamental. And one presumes it will be an area for further research among specialists, or at least one hopes. We have another question from Chuck Wooler, which I'll just summarize by saying, given the variegated threat to the homeland, chemical, bio, cyber, that could, potentially be deployed by terrorists, can the U.S. government deal effectively with these three threats, and possibly, at the same time, the low-tech threats that Paul Pillar described, without a unitary agency that can deal with all of that? Because some of it is in the Department of Defense, some of it is in the Department of Homeland Security, some of it is at the level of local law enforcement or national level law enforcement at FBI. So is there any reorganization of government implied by these various threats that could emerge in the future? Snap answers on this, because there are quite a few questions that I'd like to get through. Let's start with Jill.
Yeah,
Sorry.
This is an ironic question, given that DHS was created in the wake of 9/11 in order to solve all of these problems that the questioner identifies. Now, whether in fact it succeeded or whether it has simply managed to expand the national security state and the military-industrial complex is an open question at this point.
Yeah, well, the DHS left out FBI, of course, which would have been, maybe it was just an oversight, but yeah, it was missing that component. Jutta?
Well, so a lot of these low-level threats, I think the real serious issue is at the state level and state level capabilities. That's actually where I think the biggest problem rests.
Okay. Paul, you were in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, well, moving boxes around on the government's organization chart is a favorite response when bad things happen. It doesn't tend to solve problems. I've been on record for some time as saying, let's wait until the next big, quote, intelligence failure to reorganize again, when there'll be a demand to do it anyway. But let's not cause more disruption with more reorganizations in the meantime. As Professor Hazelton mentioned, that was supposedly all done in response to 9/11.
Okay, I'd have to agree with that. I don't see much point of reorganization myself. Let's see. Okay, so Frank Rettenberg calls attention to a statement by Bill Burns, the current director of CIA, that, well, it's a report indicating that the CIA under Bill Burns is retreating from its past focus on kinetic operations. That's for those in the audience who aren't familiar with the jargon. Kinetic operations are ones that use weapons that kill people. So is this appropriate? The questioner asks. Let's start with you, Paul.
Yes, it's appropriate. I mean, we already touched earlier on the issue of counterproductivity of such operations, and I won't repeat what I said before, but this also gets into the larger issue, of the proper mission and focus of an agency like CIA. It's not just Bill Burns, but also, I mean, John Brennan, when he was director, was saying this as well. It's appropriate for that agency to get back to its core missions of collecting and analyzing intelligence rather than being primarily a paramilitary operation, which never consumed most of the workforce's attention. You had plenty of collectors and analysts who were doing their regular intelligence business, but as a matter of leadership focus and how the outside world sees the organization, yes, I think it's overdue, and what Director Burns is reportedly trying to do is entirely in the right direction.
So two issues. One is the CIA shouldn't be doing it, period. And secondly, these operations cause more trouble than they solve.
Right.
Okay, Jutta?
Well, so I'm concerned about the results with respect to intelligence gathering resulting from the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We have listened to President Biden say that we're going to compensate with what he described as over-the-horizon intelligence gathering. Now, that's all fair, well, but I am very skeptical about that. And actually, I would hazard the guess that the disaster in Kabul was because information was provided through channels in the Taliban rather than through direct intelligence. And therefore, the United States ended up bombing an aid worker rather than an ISIS truck that allegedly was on its way to bomb the airport. I think there is a disaster going down that road. I'm very skeptical about this effort to work together with the Taliban to fight ISIS. I don't see the shades of difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are, in my view, like cats. In the darkness, all cats are gray. So I am very skeptical about that. And we have information. We knew already what happened with the Islamic State after the withdrawal from Iraq, where we were left without intelligence on the ground. So intelligence gathering and collaboration, multilateralism, these are very difficult things to go about because we are dealing with allies that are also sometimes enemies. Just take Turkey. This is a very complicated situation, and I don't really know that I have any good advice, but I do think that intelligence gathering has to take a whole new format in these days, and ruling out the local element is just a disaster.
Just a two-word response to Paul's argument that the Taliban are highly motivated to fight against ISIS because they're quote unquote mortal enemies. You disagree with that?
Why should we care? Why should we care that ISIS is attacking the Taliban's locations?
Well, Steve, I think we should also point out, I mean, the Taliban and ISIS are not two different colors of the same cat. You know, the Taliban are a highly insular group that is focused strongly on political and social order in Afghanistan. They are not an international terrorist group. The worst thing that ever happened to them was in response to bin Laden's 9/11 operation. That's a much different kind of animal than what ISIS is.
Yeah, based on my understanding of the Taliban and ISIS ideology, I'd have to agree. I think there are strong differences, but that's for further discussion. I was just going to ask Jill to follow up on these points by asking whether there were ever instances where, setting aside the agency that carries out kinetic operations, whether it's CIA or the Department of Defense, are there ever occasions when it really does behoove the United States to carry out raids to kill bad guys? And just as I was formulating that question, one of our listeners, Kimberly Stanton, weighed in by saying that strengthening rule of law and protecting human rights are a pillar of U.S. global counterterrorism strategy, Could the panelists share their views on the role of human rights in fighting terrorism? And it sort of bears on this question of what the United States should be doing unilaterally in terms of raids and targeted killing and so forth to deal with malefactors. What manner of relations should the U.S. have with states, as Paul was saying, the U.S. conventionally does in this liaison area? What kind of relations the United States should have with foreign states that are oppressors, that are violators of human rights? Would you want to take that on?
That's a huge number of questions. Let me pull on just one or two threads. In terms of the U.S. relationship with human rights abusers, that goes back a long way. The United States has the twin strands of idealism and practicality that run throughout its history of foreign policy. Our small group raids, drone strikes, etc., a useful tool? Yes. Now, I have argued that drone strikes in particular are not a particularly important tool for the United States because the threat of terrorism to the United States is relatively limited. But to tie that point in with the question of returning the CIA to its main mission and the human rights question, to wrap it all up with a bow, one of the most interesting things that the CIA has been doing over the past less than 20 years, but close to 20 years, because the kinetification started with Petraeus, is building militias within other states. And this has been particularly prominent in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, the CIA-built militias have been particularly effective in wielding violence for political ends, and they have also been, as I understand it, particularly disliked by the populace. Now, if it is the case that successful counterinsurgency requires gaining public popularity, which of course I don't find to be the case given my own research, then these kinetic raids, this use of militias poses a particular problem for the United States because it claims to want to live up to its values, and the rest of the world is very aware that it does not.
Obviously, there is a huge conflict, difficult trade-offs between, on the one hand, promoting human rights and lawful counterterrorism and building alliances and decentralizing the fight against terrorism. Those two things will inevitably rub against each other again and again. And I think the exhibit A in that is actually Pakistan. And this has United States been unable to really find a balance on these issues. I don't actually think that there is any easy answers. The aggressive promotion and of human rights as a contingency, as a requirement for any type of collaboration is bound to fail. But what we have seen is that the United States has done something very different. This country has swung from one tactic and strategy to another again and again. If you take the war in Iraq, many people rightfully blaming that war from causing a lot of harm to the United States, and it did. But it is not accurate to think that had we not gone to war in Iraq, Saddam Hussein would still be there and the Islamic State would never have happened. There would still have been an Arab Spring, there would still have been a civil war, and there would still have been insurgencies, most likely, because the underlying structural factors are what they are. Now, this leaves the United States in a very complicated situation. And frankly, I've gotten to that point where if this country could just get to a point where there's some stability and consensus about process, that I would take any time or any of these, what we have seen from the Bush administration onto the Obama and then Donald Trump's unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan to what we don't really quite know what is going on right now. This is not something you can, this type of fluctuation is just very contrary to American interest and to, also to our treasure and to the troops.
Paul?
On the question of human rights, although it's true that a concern for human rights often seems to rub up against counter-terrorist objectives, I think given that the human rights situation in country X is part of that political and social milieu that determines the extent to which people do or do not resort to the extreme tactic of terrorism, the conflict may be less one of human rights versus counterterrorism and one between the short-term interest in trying to get at whoever you perceive as the bad guys right now, and a longer-term interest in reducing the motivation to resort to terrorism. I'm thinking of, say, the al-Sisi regime in Egypt, with its head-cracking, really hardcore way of going about internal security, which may, in the short term, round up some few would-be wrongdoers, but in the longer term creates an environment or sustains an environment in which there is going to be the kind of motivation and hatred that will breed the same kinds of Egyptian terrorist groups that we've had in the past that were trying to go after Hosni Mubarak. So that's another form of counterproductivity, but you have to break down between the short term and the long term, and that's how human rights often figures into it.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. It's really hard to do as a practical matter. So I just want to wrap up the Afghanistan question before I proceed to my last one, which has to do with domestic terrorism, things like that. So what I'm hearing on Afghanistan is, okay, from Paul's perspective, you use the time-tested foreign liaison, work with the Taliban, as frustrating as it might be, to acquire intelligence regarding the maturation of an Al-Qaeda threat or ISIS threat, what have you, that could damage American interests, and just hammer away at that. Now, what I hear from Jutta is something a bit more depressing, which is that now that we're gone, we're really sunk. There will be this maturing of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda threats in Afghanistan, and there won't be much that the United States could do about it because, we're not there. From Jill, I think, her view is, well, we'll be okay because, to paraphrase Bomber Harris or whoever it was, the bomber will always get through. Which is to say, listen, even if we're not there, if we get intelligence that there are some, bad actors down there, we can send in airplanes or drones or what have you, and just blow them up. So these are very sort of crude characterizations of each of your points, but I just want to get a sense whether or not my characterization is somewhat true to your views. So Jill?
I would like to back it up a minute to address the question of US interest in Afghanistan. The United States has no core or important interest in Afghanistan. As in South Vietnam, the only interest in the territory is that what the United States paints as opponents happen to be on that territory. It's Afghanistan qua Afghanistan means nothing to the United States. So starting with that position, I do think that the United States and the Taliban have good reason to work together in certain areas, and that is very much fine with me. I also think that the moral position that the United States should not be releasing excuse me, aid and money to the Taliban in order to pressure them into respect for human rights is not actually a moral position that we can support because it leads to more death. The situation in Afghanistan in terms of starvation, drought, and still some political violence is drastically bad. And I think the right moral position for the United States is to do what it can to help that public, whether or not it bolsters the Taliban. That's whether bolstering the Taliban is far less important to the United States morally than doing what it can to save those lives.
Okay, got it. Yossi?
Look, the most likely scenario in Afghanistan is that there will be a civil war in 5 years. The Taliban is not a uniform organization. The Haqqani group, which is the Syrian Haqqani, who is the Minister of the Interior in charge of domestic security and rounding up people, sits on the Shura Council of Al-Qaeda and have personally met with Ayman al-Zawahiri back in February. Al-Qaeda has declared their allegiance to the Haqqani group. Then there are the pretty boys who spent some years in Qatar and have all their groomed eyebrows and their starched shirts. This is not a uniform organization. And there are many groups. I mean, Afghanistan is an extraordinarily diverse group. And this whole debate that we have had here has ignored that there are warlords and tribal groups that will have nothing to do with the Taliban. So the real question is, what does the United States do when the civil war breaks out? And the more important thing I think that we have neglected to discuss here is that we are now also dealing with a mini jihadistan in Idlib province on the southern border of Turkey that's sitting there because it's actually in the interest of Turkey to have this HTS group sitting there. And HTS, which is, we don't quite know what the relationship to Al-Qaeda is, has now managed to impose Sharia law. Its version of Sharia law has put down all the other groups, the rival fighter groups, and established control, making loads of money on transporter traffic. Now, we are dealing with a situation where we have these types of groups turning up into sort of regional power struggles and proxy wars. That's what the real challenge is going to be.
Okay, so we've got this problem more than just in Afghanistan and other places, particularly Syria, which is important because it's close to Turkey. I mean, from my own perspective, I'm not too worried about that, but I could see how it fits in to a broader picture of a dispersed jihadist threat, and in Idlib there's certainly jihadists. There's a Disneyland there now. Actually, they made their own Disneyland. They pay absolutely no attention to U.S. trademarks. Just, I think it's a damn shame. Paul?
Well, just if the question, I agree, it is a question, is what the United States does if there's a civil war that's resurrected in Afghanistan. The one thing we should remember above all about that is that when the Taliban back when welcomed assistance from Al-Qaeda and bin Laden's people, it was in the midst of a raging civil war. They had no interest, no positive interest in the international terrorist activities of Al-Qaeda. And as I mentioned before, the biggest setback the Taliban ever suffered was a direct response to the 9/11 operation. But the one thing that I think would motivate the Taliban to once again welcome the assistance of a group like Al-Qaeda is a restoked Afghan civil war. So we ought to refrain from stoking that sort of thing and getting back in the regime change mode, because that's exactly the sort of situation that would resurrect the pre-9/11 circumstance in Afghanistan.
Really interesting view. I wish we could take this further, but I need to turn this back over to Kelly to wrap up. Thank you all, for joining us. But I'll leave the thanks to Kelly. Kelly, over to you.
Well, yes, thank you. I've done a number of these panels, introducing and closing them up and moderating. And often I say we could have gone on for hours, but I mean, this isn't one of those cases where I feel like we just scratched the surface of the issue. And so looking forward to maybe fleshing this out in another panel at some point. Before I go, I would like to remind folks that we have our last event of the year, which is tomorrow, and it's a debate. It's a debate on whether the U.S. should seek a containment policy against China. And on one side of the dial, we have John Mearsheimer, who is a Quincy non-resident fellow, professor at University of Chicago. And on the other side, David Kang, who is also a Quincy non-resident fellow and a professor at the University of Southern California. And we will be debating at 12 o'clock tomorrow. That is Thursday. And if you would like to join us, we hope you will. You can find the link at quincyinst.org and go to events. And if you want to find out more about Quincy, please go to our website, go to responsiblestatecraft.org as well. We have a ton of stories up there and lots about us and our experts. And so thank you, panelists, for this engaging conversation, and Stephen, for your moderation, and hope to see everyone tomorrow. And if not, in the new year.